Welcome to our continuing series, Questions and Answers from the words of Sri Aurobindo and Mother. Today's subject is Knowledge Part 3. Our surface cognition, our limited and restricted mental way of looking at ourself, at our inner movements, and at the world outside us and its objects and happenings, is so constituted that it derives in different degrees from a fourfold order of knowledge. The original and fundamental way of knowing, native to the occult self in things, is a knowledge by identity. The second, derivative, is a knowledge by direct contact, associated at its roots with a secret knowledge by identity or starting from it, but actually separated from its source, and therefore powerful but incomplete in its cognition. The third is a knowledge by separation from the object of observation, but still with a direct contact as its support or even a partial identity. The fourth is a completely separative knowledge which relies on a machinery of indirect contact, a knowledge by acquisition which is yet, without being conscious of it, a rendering or bringing up of the contents of a pre-existent inner awareness and knowledge. A knowledge by identity, a knowledge by intimate direct contact, a knowledge by separative direct contact, a wholly separative knowledge by indirect contact are the four cognitive methods of nature. The first way of knowing in its purest form is illustrated in the surface mind only by our direct awareness of our own essential existence. It is a knowledge empty of any other content than the pure fact of self and being. Of nothing else in the world has our surface mind the same kind of awareness. But in the knowledge of the structure and movements of our subjective consciousness, some element of awareness by identity does enter. For we can project ourselves with a certain identification into these movements. It has already been noted how this can happen in the case of an uprush of wrath which swallows us up, so that for the moment our whole consciousness seems to be a wave of anger. Other passions, love, grief, joy, have the same power to seize and occupy us. Thought also absorbs and occupies. We lose sight of the thinker and become the thought and the thinking. But very ordinarily, there is a double movement. A part of ourselves becomes the thought or the passion. Another part of us either accompanies it with a certain adherence or follows it closely and knows it by an intimate direct contact which falls short of identification or entire self-oblivion in the movement. This identification is possible, and also this simultaneous separation and partial identification, because these things are becomings of our being, determinations of our mind stuff and mind energy, of our life stuff and life energy. But since they are only a small part of us, we are not bound to be identified and occupied. We can detach ourselves, separate the being from its temporary becoming, observe it, control it, sanction or prevent its manifestation. We can, in this way, by an inner detachment, a mentor or spiritual separateness, partially or even fundamentally liberate ourselves from the control of mind nature or vital nature over the being and assume the position of the witness, knower, and ruler. Thus, we have a double knowledge of the subjective movement. There is an intimate knowledge by identity of its stuff and its force of action, more intimate than we could have by any entirely separative and objective knowledge, such as we get of things outside us, things that are to us altogether not self. There is at the same time a knowledge by detached observation, detached but with the power of direct contact, which frees us from engrossment by the nature energy and enables us to relate the movement to the rest of our own existence and world existence. If we are without this detachment, we lose our self of being and mastering knowledge in the nature self of becoming and movement and action. And though we know intimately the movement, we do not know it dominatingly and fully. Here, then, in our subjective experience, we have a field of the action of consciousness in which three movements of cognition can meet together: a certain kind of knowledge by identity, a knowledge by direct contact, and dependent upon them, a separative knowledge. But whatever the kind of identification, it is to be noted that the knowledge of our internal movements is of a double nature: separation and direct contact. For even when we detach ourselves, this close contact is maintained. Our knowledge is always based on a direct touch, on a cognition by direct awareness, carrying in it a certain element of identity. All the observable movements of our physical being also are known and controlled by us in both these ways: the separative and the intimate. We feel the body and what it is doing intimately as part of us, but the mind is separate from it and can exercise a detached control over its movements. This gives to our normal knowledge of our subjective being and nature, incomplete and largely superficial though it still is, yet, so far as it goes, a certain intimacy, immediacy, and directness. That is absent in our knowledge of the world outside us and its movements and objects. For there, since the thing seen or experienced is not self, not experienced as part of us, no entirely direct contact of consciousness with the object is possible. An instrumentation of sense has to be used which offers us not immediate intimate knowledge of it, but a figure of it as a first datum for knowledge. Our world knowledge is therefore a difficult structure made up of the imperfect documentation of the sense image, an intuitional interpretation of it by perceptive mind, life mind, and sense mind, and a supplementary filling up, correction, addition of supplementary knowledge, coordination by the reason. Even so, our knowledge of the world we live in is narrow and imperfect. Our interpretations of its significance is doubtful. Imagination, speculation, reflection, impartial weighing and reasoning, inference, measurement, testing, a further correction and amplification of sense evidence by science, all this apparatus had to be called in to complete the incompleteness. After all that, the result still remains a half certain, half dubious accumulation of acquired indirect knowledge, a mass of significant images and ideative representations, abstract thought counters, hypotheses, theories, generalizations, but also with all that a mass of doubts and a never ending debate and inquiry. Power has come with knowledge, but our imperfection of knowledge leaves us without any idea of the true use of the power, even of the aim towards which our utilization of knowledge and power should be turned and made effective. This is worsened by the imperfection of our self knowledge, which, such as it is, meager and pitifully insufficient, is of our surface only, of our apparent phenomenal self and nature, and not of our true self and the true meaning of our existence. Self knowledge and self mastery are wanting in the user. Wisdom and right will in his use of world power and world knowledge. It is evident that our state on the surface is indeed a state of knowledge, so far as it goes, but a limited knowledge enveloped and invaded by ignorance, and to a very large extent, by reason of its limitation, itself a kind of ignorance, at best a mixed knowledge ignorance. It could not be otherwise, since our awareness of the world is born of a separative and surface observation with only an indirect means of cognition at its disposal. Our knowledge of ourselves, though more direct, is stultified by its restriction to the surface of our being, by an ignorance of our true self, the true sources of our nature, the true motive forces of our action. It is quite evident that we know ourselves with only a superficial knowledge. The sources of our consciousness and thought are a mystery. The true nature of our mind, emotions, sensations is a mystery. Our cause of being and our end of being, the significance of our life and its activities are a mystery. This could not be if we had a real self knowledge and a real world knowledge. It is then this double wall of self imprisonment, this self fortification in the bounds of a surface ego, that is the cause of our limited knowledge or ignorance. And if this self imprisonment were the whole character of our existence, the ignorance would be irremediable. But, in fact, this constant outer ego building is only a provisional device of the consciousness force in things, so that the secret individual, the spirit within, may establish a representative and instrumental formation of itself in physical nature, a provisional individualization in the nature of the ignorance, which is all that can at first be done in a world emerging out of a universal inconscience. Our self-ignorance and our world ignorance can only grow towards integral self-knowledge and integral world knowledge in proportion as our limited ego and its half-blind consciousness open to a greater inner existence and consciousness and a true self-being, and become aware too of the not self outside it also as self. On one side, a nature constituent of our own nature, on the other, an existence which is a boundless continuation of our own self-being. Our being has to break the walls of ego consciousness which it has created. It has to extend itself beyond its body and inhabit the body of the universe. In place of its knowledge by indirect contact, or in addition to it, it must arrive at a knowledge by direct contact and proceed to a knowledge by identity. Its limited finite of self has to become a boundless finite and an infinite. It is then the knowledge of this inner initiating self, coupled with the accurate perception of the outer instrumental self and the part played by both of them in our building, that we have to discover. On the surface, we know only so much of ourself as is formulated there, and of even this only a portion. For we see our total surface being in a general vagueness, dotted and sectioned by points or figures of precision. even what we discover by a mental introspection is only a sum of sections. The entire figure and sense of our personal formation escapes our notice. But there is also a distorting action which obscures and disfigures even this limited self knowledge. Our self view is vitiated by the constant impact and intrusion of our outer life self, our vital being, which seeks always to make the thinking mind its tool and servant. For our vital being is not concerned with self knowledge, but with self affirmation, desire, ego.